Louisville, Kentucky, 1967. The air was thick with tension as 25-year-old Muhammad Ali stepped onto the worn mat of Ronnie Smith's boxing gym. 6 weeks remained before his title defense against Ernie Terrell, and the normally jovial champion's face was set in stone. His childhood friend and assistant trainer Drew Bundini Brown watched with concern as Ali wrapped his hands with methodical precision, the only sound in the gym the rhythmic slap of tape against skin. "You still carrying that anger, champ?" Bundini asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since the morning news conference. "Don't let Terrell get in your head." Ali looked up, his eyes flashing with rare fury. "You heard what he called me. You heard him say Cassius Clay over and over when he knows that's not my name anymore. He's trying to disrespect not just me, but my faith, my choice, everything I stand for. If this story has already made you feel something, no matter how small, don't leave without giving back. Comment and tell me where you're watching this video from, and subscribe to the channel." The confrontation at the press conference that morning had been brutal. Ernie Terrell, 6 feet 6 inches of coiled aggression, had deliberately antagonized Ali by repeatedly calling him by his birth name, Cassius Clay, a name Ali had rejected 3 years earlier when he converted to Islam. In those days, when racial tensions ran high and Ali's religious conversion was viewed with suspicion and hostility by much of white America, Terrell's insistence on using his former name felt like more than disrespect. It felt like an attack on his identity, his dignity, his very right to self-determination. "I'll make him say my name," Ali muttered, moving toward the heavy bag. "In that ring, I swear I'll make him say it." As Ali began his workout, his trainer Angelo Dundee entered the gym, his face grim. He'd just come from a meeting with the fight promoters, who were concerned about Ali's increasingly inflammatory comments about the upcoming bout. What had begun as typical pre-fight hype was evolving into something darker, more personal. "Muhammad," Dundee said quietly, using the name his fighter had chosen, unlike many others in the boxing world who still refused. "This thing with Terrell, it's getting out of hand. The press is having a field day." Ali paused, his chest heaving from exertion. "You know what this is about, Angie. This isn't just boxing. This is about respect." Dundee nodded, understanding the deeper currents at play. In 1967, Muhammad Ali stood at the intersection of America's most volatile fault lines: race, religion, and politics. Less than a year earlier, he had defied the U.S. government by refusing to be drafted into the Vietnam War, famously declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." The backlash had been swift and merciless. State boxing commissions threatened to revoke his license. The mainstream press vilified him. Death threats arrived daily at his home. Against this backdrop, Terrell's insistence on calling him Cassius Clay felt like yet another attempt to put him in his place, to deny his agency, to cast him as unpatriotic, ungrateful, unworthy of the respect accorded to other champions. As the days passed and the fight drew nearer, Ali's anger didn't dissipate. It crystallized. In training sessions, he was sharper, faster, more focused than Dundee had ever seen him. But there was something else there too, something that worried the veteran trainer, a coldness, a desire not just to win, but to punish. "I'm not just going to beat him," Ali told reporters at the final press conference. "I'm going to make him suffer for as long as possible." On the night of February 6th, 1967, 15,000 spectators packed the Houston Astrodome. Millions more tuned in via closed-circuit television. They expected to see a boxing match. What they witnessed instead was something far more primal, a public reckoning, a demand for recognition that transcended sport. From the opening bell, it was clear this would be unlike any fight in Ali's career. He possessed every advantage: speed, skill, footwork. Yet rather than ending the fight quickly as he could have, he prolonged it. Between flurries of punishing jabs and crosses, he would pause, lean in, and taunt his increasingly battered opponent. "What's my name?" he demanded repeatedly, punctuating the question with stinging blows. "What's my name?" By the 8th round, Terrell's face was a mask of blood and swelling, his left eye completely closed. Still, Ali refused to deliver the knockout blow. He continued his methodical dismantling, round after brutal round, repeating his question, "What's my name?" Terrell never answered, and Ali never relented. For 15 punishing rounds, he administered a beating so severe that even his supporters grew uncomfortable. When the final bell rang and Ali was declared the winner by unanimous decision, there were no celebrations, no joyous dancing around the ring. Just a heavy, unsettled silence as the champion left the ring, his face still set in that cold mask of anger. Dawn broke over Houston the morning after the fight, pale light spilling through the curtains of Muhammad Ali's hotel suite. He sat alone on the edge of the bed, staring at his unmarked hands, hands that had, just hours before, inflicted such deliberate suffering on another human being. In the bathroom, he could hear Bandini on the phone with Angelo Dundee, their hushed voices discussing the avalanche of negative press that had already begun. Saying he was cruel, Bandini was saying. The New York Times is calling it one of the ugliest boxing spectacles since the days of the Roman Colosseum. They're saying he dishonored the sport. Ali closed his eyes, unexpected shame washing over him. Throughout his career, he had cultivated an image of lightness, the dancing, rhyming, beautiful butterfly who could sting like a bee. Yet last night, there had been no beauty in what he'd done, no poetry. Just rage and humiliation inflicted with surgical precision. A knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. It was Howard Cosell, the ABC sportscaster whose relationship with Ali had evolved from professional interest to genuine friendship. One of the few white men in the sports world who consistently called him Muhammad rather than Cassius. "The press is having a field day," Cosell said without preamble, dropping a stack of newspapers on the coffee table. "Lipsight in the Times is particularly brutal. Says you showed a streak of cruelty unworthy of a champion." Ali didn't respond immediately. He picked up the top newspaper, scanning the headlines. "Yi Clay tortures Terrell. Cruel Ali punishes foe for 15 rounds. They still won't call me by my name," he noted quietly, pointing to the headline. Cosell sighed, removing his trademark hairpiece and running a hand over his bald head, something he did only in front of those he trusted completely. "Muhammad, I understand why you were angry. But what happened in that ring last night? It wasn't just about your name anymore. It became something else." "What do you mean?" Ali asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "You had the chance to be merciful, and you chose not to be," Cosell said bluntly. "That's not the Muhammad Ali I know. The man I know talks about justice and dignity for all people. The man I know quotes his spiritual teachings about compassion." Ali looked away, unable to meet his friend's gaze. The righteous anger that had fueled him through 15 rounds had faded, leaving behind a hollow feeling he couldn't quite name. Was it regret? Not for winning, never that, but perhaps for the manner of the victory, for allowing another man's disrespect to pull him so far away from his own principles. "Ernie Terrell is in the hospital," Cosell continued. "Orbital bone fracture, retinal damage. They're not sure if he'll regain full vision in his left eye." The words hung in the air between them. Ali stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the Houston skyline. The city was waking up, people going about their Monday morning routines, unaware of the crisis of conscience unfolding 30 floors above them. What would the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, have done? Ali asked softly, more to himself than to Cosell. What would he say about how I conducted myself? Before Cosell could answer, the phone rang. It was Herbert Mohammed, Ali's manager and spiritual advisor. The conversation was brief, but when Ali hung up, his expression had changed. There was resolve there now, determination replacing uncertainty. "I need to go to the hospital," he said. "To make a statement to the press?" Cosell asked. Ali shook his head. "No cameras, no press. Just me." 40 minutes later, Ali stood outside the door of Terrell's private hospital room. He had come alone, dismissing his usual entourage, wearing sunglasses and a simple suit rather than his customary flamboyant attire. For perhaps the first time since he'd become champion, Muhammad Ali wasn't trying to be seen. He knocked softly, then pushed the door open. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light to protect Terrell's injured eyes. The fighter lay in bed, his face grotesquely swollen, both eyes now patched with gauze. A nurse was adjusting his IV, and she started in surprise at the sight of Ali in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply, moving as if to block him from entering further. "It's okay," came Terrell's voice from the bed, raspy and weak. "Let him in." Ali stepped into the room, removing his sunglasses. Without the buffer of crowds, cameras, or the heightened emotion of competition, the two men were simply humans, one who had inflicted harm, one who had received it. "I came to say I'm sorry," Ali said, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. Muhammad Ali, self-proclaimed greatest of all time, apologizing to anyone, let alone a defeated opponent. It was unprecedented, not for winning, but for how I won, for making it personal, for hurting you more than I needed to. Terrell was silent for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he extended his hand. "Muhammad," he said, emphasizing the name, "I appreciate you coming." 2 days after visiting Terrell in the hospital, Muhammad Ali sat in the wood-paneled office of his attorney in Chicago, surrounded by his closest advisors. The meeting had been called to discuss a growing crisis, one that made the controversy over the Terrell fight seem insignificant by comparison. "The government isn't bluffing," his lawyer explained grimly. "The Justice Department has made it clear. You'll be indicted for draft evasion unless you agree to serve. No special treatment, no stateside posting." Vietnam, just like any other 25-year-old from the South Side. Ali's opposition to the Vietnam War had been public for nearly a year. His famous declaration, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," sending shockwaves through American society. But now the theoretical was becoming actual. The choice was stark: compromise his principles or face prison and the destruction of his career. "How long would I go to jail?" Ali asked, his voice unnaturally quiet. 5 years, maximum fine of $10,000, and you'd be stripped of your title, the lawyer replied. "Not to mention you'd be banned from boxing during your prime years. By the time you got out, you'd be 30. It would be over, Muhammad." Herbert Mohammed, sitting to Ali's right, shook his head in frustration. "The Nation of Islam cannot protect you from this. Not legally. But spiritually, we stand with whatever decision you make that honors your faith." Ali stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The visit with Terrell was still fresh in his mind, the humility it had required, the strange peace it had brought. Something had shifted in him during that quiet hospital room encounter. A recognition that true strength wasn't about domination or even righteous anger, but about alignment with one's deepest values, even when, especially when, it cost you something. "I've been thinking about my grandfather," Ali said suddenly. "He was born in slavery in Kentucky, couldn't read or write, wasn't allowed to look a white man in the eye without risking a beating or worse." He turned back to face the room. He didn't have choices. "I do." Muhammad, his financial advisor, interjected. We're talking about millions of dollars. Your legacy, everything you've worked for. My legacy isn't about how many fights I won or how much money I made, Ali replied. It's about whether I stood for something, whether I was willing to lose everything for what I believe. The room fell silent. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the Chicago streets with white. "Yee, what exactly are you saying, Muhammad?" Herbert finally asked. "I'm saying I'm going to do what I should have done with Terrell. Show mercy, stand on principle, not anger. I won't fight in Vietnam, but I also won't publicly attack anyone else who makes a different choice. I'll simply stand on my truth, accept the consequences, and trust that Allah has a purpose in all of this." The decision made, events unfolded with dizzying speed. On April 28, 1967, Ali reported as ordered to the Armed Forces Induction Center in Houston, but refused to step forward when his name was called. Within hours, he was stripped of his heavyweight title. His boxing license was suspended in every state. The financial consequences were immediate and devastating. Millions in cancelled fights, endorsements withdrawn overnight. But something unexpected happened in the weeks and months that followed. Rather than retreating from public life, Ali became more visible than ever, not as a boxer, but as a speaker. He crisscrossed the country, appearing at college campuses, community centers, religious gatherings. Without the pressure of training camps and title defenses, he had time to read, to think, to develop his voice beyond the clever rhymes and pre-fight boasts. And most surprisingly, he did it without bitterness. The anger that had driven him to punish Terrell seemed to have burned away, replaced by a serenity that confused his critics and inspired his supporters. When interviewed about the potential destruction of his career, he would smile and quote the Quran, "Perhaps you hate a thing and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it is bad for you. And Allah knows, while you know not." As public opinion about the Vietnam War began to shift, so too did perceptions of Ali. The man who had been vilified as unpatriotic was increasingly viewed as principled, even prophetic. The stance that had cost him everything was gradually recognized as one of the most significant acts of moral courage in American sports history. 8 years later, on an unseasonably warm October evening in 1975, Muhammad Ali stood in his dressing room at Araneta Coliseum in Manila, Philippines. At 33, he was no longer the young phenom who had shocked Sonny Liston, no longer even the firebrand who had refused induction into the armed forces. Time and experience had weathered him. 4 years in exile, followed by a return to boxing that had seen both triumph and defeat. Tonight, he had survived what would later be called the greatest boxing match in history, the Thriller in Manila, against Joe Frazier. 14 brutal rounds that had pushed both men to the absolute limits of human endurance. Ali had emerged victorious when Frazier's corner threw in the towel before the 15th round, but the cost had been enormous. Every part of his body screamed in pain. His face was swollen beyond recognition. He had, by his own later admission, never been closer to death in the ring. "Is Joe okay?" he asked his trainer, Angelo Dundee, who was helping him dress for the post-fight press conference. "He's in bad shape," Dundee replied honestly. "They took him to the hospital as a precaution, but he'll recover." Ali nodded, wincing as he eased his arms into his shirt sleeves. The rivalry with Frazier had been long and bitter, marked by Ali's often cruel verbal attacks. He had called Frazier an Uncle Tom, a gorilla, taunts designed to wound Frazier in ways that went beyond the physical. It had worked. Frazier's hatred for Ali had become legendary, driving him to push through pain and punishment that would have stopped lesser men. Yet now, in the aftermath of their final, most punishing encounter, Ali felt none of the triumph he had expected. Instead, he was overcome with a profound respect for his opponent and regret for the unnecessary cruelty of his pre-fight taunts. "I need to see him," Ali said suddenly, stopping Dundee's ministrations. "Before the press conference, I need to see Joe." Dundee looked skeptical. "Champ, there's no time. The president is waiting. The whole world press is waiting." "Let them wait," Ali replied, with a flash of the old imperial certainty. "And this is more important." 30 minutes later, Ali walked into Manila General Hospital. Despite his celebrity, despite the Philippine president waiting at the Coliseum, he had insisted on coming alone. No entourage, no photographers. Just a man seeking to make right a wrong that had festered for years. Joe Frazier lay in a private room, his face so swollen his features were barely recognizable. An IV dripped fluids into his arm. A doctor stood at his bedside, making notes on a chart. "I need a moment with him," Ali said quietly. The doctor looked uncertain, but Frazier's voice came from the bed. "It's all right, let him in." The doctor withdrew, and Ali approached the bedside. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They had shared a canvas for 41 rounds across 3 fights, had inflicted tremendous suffering on each other, had defined their careers in opposition to one another. What could possibly be said to encompass all of that? "You're the greatest fighter I've ever faced," Ali said finally. "The toughest man I've ever known." Frazier's swollen eyes regarded him warily. "Why are you here, Ali?" "To apologize," Ali replied simply. "The things I said before our fights, they went beyond promotion. I made it personal in ways it didn't need to be. I tried to dehumanize you to make it easier to hurt you. That was wrong. I've learned a lot since the Terrell fight, and one thing I've learned is that we can be opponents without being enemies." Frazier was silent for so long that Ali wondered if he'd fallen asleep or simply chosen not to respond. But then, with visible effort, Frazier extended his hand. "We've given each other a lot," he said. "Taken a lot from each other too. Maybe it's time to let the past stay past." Ali took his hand, feeling the strength still present in the fingers that had connected with his jaw more times than he cared to remember. "I'd like that, Joe." The reconciliation, when it became public, shocked the boxing world. 2 men whose hatred had seemed elemental, irrevocable, finding their way to mutual respect, if not quite friendship. But those who knew Ali best were less surprised. They had witnessed his evolution, from the brash young champion who had tormented Ernie Terrell, to the principled, conscientious objector, to this more reflective figure who understood that greatness was measured in more than victories. In the years that followed, as Parkinson's disease gradually robbed him of his physical prowess and eventually his voice, Muhammad Ali's stature only grew. The stance that had once made him one of the most divisive figures in American sports transformed him into one of its most revered. His journey, from punishment to principle, from division to reconciliation, became a blueprint for how athletes could use their platform for more than fame and fortune. On a warm summer day in 2016, as Muhammad Ali was laid to rest in his hometown of Louisville, Joe Frazier's son Marvis was among the pallbearers. Ernie Terrell sent flowers with a card that read simply, "To Muhammad, a name and a man I learned to respect." The boy who had begun life as Cassius Clay, who had fought not just for championships, but for the right to define himself on his own terms, had completed a journey more profound than any 12-round bout. He had learned that true greatness lies not in never falling or failing, but in how you rise, how you reconcile, how you find the courage to face not just external opponents, but your own weaknesses and mistakes. In a career defined by legendary moments, Perhaps his most shocking acts were not the knockouts or the political stands, but the quiet moments of humility and reconciliation that showed the true measure of the man behind the mythology. The greatest fighter of all time, whose most enduring victory was learning when not to fight. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing. I tell these stories with my heart in my hand to reach people like you, who feel, who get emotional, who live. If this really touched you, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.